convene this meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee of the San Lorenzo Valley Water District for September 12th, 2023. Holly, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, Gail Mayhood.
Here.
Jeff Hill.
Here.
Jim Bond.
Here.
Jim Mosier.
Here.
Monica Martinez.
Here.
Great. Okay, this is the part of the meeting that we have oral communications from members of the public who would like to speak on items that are on the agenda. I don't think I don't see any members of the public, or well, maybe they're there in the room and I can't see them. Are there any?
No, we have Sudhir. I'm going to promote him to panelist. Sudhir is the only person.
And similarly, actually, well, here it shows Jeff and Jim Mosher as being as attendees also. Well, okay, wait a minute, they're being promoted. Okay, great. So there's no oral communications from members of the public. So we'll move on to unfinished business, which is the rate study update, and I want to really thank Sudhir for making time to meet with us today and help us move through these questions, and I'll turn it over to Rick.
Thank you, Gail. I'm not sure, Kendra, what is the stuff, or
yeah,
if I can kick off.
I can take it off. Okay, so as we all know, last Thursday at the September 7th board meeting, there was an initial presentation on the 10-year financial plan given by Raftellus, our rate study consultants. At that meeting, we wanted to get feedback from the board and input from the public. So, you know, Gail has put together a list of questions. I have added some of the questions we had to that, and there's also a few questions on this list that I added from some members of the public. So everyone should have a copy of the list in front of them, and I figured we could just go through the questions and discuss. And hopefully Sudhir can jump in and help guide this discussion as well. And let's see.
No, I just want to say that you formulate a lot of questions that were put together after that meeting. And at the end of the meeting this Thursday, the board will have to make some decisions or give some directions moving forward. So that'll be important. And we'll talk about that a little bit because they're on this list. And Gail, did you get a copy of it back?
Yes, I did. Kendra sent it to me. So yeah,
Great.
So I just want to say that that basically after the last meeting, I think we recognized that, that there was a wide-ranging discussion, but sometimes it went off track in the sense that we were not talking about things that were related to the financial plan. And that at the end of the upcoming meeting on the 14th, we really need to come to some decisions or consensus so that Raftellus can go on to the next stage, which is coming up with alternative scenarios for rate schedules. So that's why we came up with this set of questions. And my hope was that if we could come up with, if the Budget and Finance Committee could have some consensus on this, it might speed the discussion or make it on the 14th about, you know, for the whole board. So that's the motivation today. And I know that means we've got a whole lot of work to do in the next 15 minutes. So we're going to have to kind of move through this quickly. But some of these are obviously things that Sudhir is going to need to move in on. And maybe we should just kind of go, rather than starting at number one, let's start at number two, which I thought was kind of on the second page, which is, you know, there's two major questions. One is, do we agree with the assumptions that they used in their model? Or, you know, or we might disagree a little bit, but it's not important. But if there's any way in which we think that they're really off, we need to identify those. The second one was kind of the elephant in the room, which is we didn't discuss which direction we thought the board wanted to go in terms of rebuilding the cross-country raw water pipelines. That is above ground and more or less as they were before the CZU fire, or buried. And I think the general feeling is that the first option would cost about a third of what the buried thing was. And there's kind of two aspects of this decision. One is largely an engineering and environmental one on the technical aspects and the impact that it might have in building it. And Rick is bringing this to the Engineering and Environmental Committee this Thursday for their consideration. What I'd like us to focus on is the impacts on the budget and the financial plan, and therefore what that translates into is the amount of revenues we need in the next 5 years. And Raftelis showed 2 slides in their presentation and showed that basically you could more or less do the buried one was a little bit more expensive, 9.5% revenue increase versus 9%. And we'd need a larger amount of debt, but not a huge amount. However, so in that regard, it wasn't very different. But what struck me when I looked at those diagrams was that it did have a big difference in terms of how rapidly we could achieve the target reserve levels, and that we needed to discuss that impact. And I don't know if other people, if it's easy to pull up those slides, or if not, if other people remember them, or hopefully they reviewed them before we came to the meeting today. But let me start with you, Jeff, and if you have any comments on this.
Just a minute, I'm looking at the slides. I have them.
I have it right here.
Okay.
This is the scenario 1. And
Yep.
scenario 2 is
Yeah,
there.
Put the slides up? Yeah, I would just say, can we
Oh,
put
that's
those slides
status
up?
quo. Here's the
Is
this
Raftelis
one
do that?
I can.
compared to this one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I can I interrupt here for just a second? I think we're looking
in
at.
fact, not just interrupt, we want you to pitch in.
I think we need to first talk about the CIP. You know, I don't know that at much point looking at these slides, because I think the costs have been updated. I don't know if Kendra or Rick or somebody wants to discuss that, but I think we had a slight issue with the CIP expenses. When we did the 2 scenarios that we talked about, we looked at the total CZU project cost of $25 and $52 million. But I think that the 25 and the $52 million were related only to a section of those projects, which is the P Wine pipeline and the I don't recall the names again off the top of my head, but there were 2 different projects which and the Clear Creek pipeline, you know, so those 2 projects by themselves are $25 million and $52 million. So the total CIP that we are looking at is actually going to be much more than the $25 and $50 million that we looked up previously. And so that requires us to update the financial plan. And now we are looking at potentially higher revenue adjustments and debt amounts as well.
Okay, let me back up then. So those amounts are for those things. So, but in terms of the reserves, you were using the $375 million in total capital assets, right?
Yes, those reserves will not change, because the reserves are based on the asset value and not upon the capital cost. So the reserve target doesn't change. The can I share my screen maybe and show you what the impacts are from these 2
I'm having a
projects?
little, so I'm not quite following what you were saying.
Let me step in.
Yeah.
So Sudhir and Lindsay and I were going over the model before the meeting, and I realized that the costs for the P-Vine and the Clear Creek needed to be updated, and that was something that was on my end that wasn't updated. So initially the scenarios that they gave were the 25 and the 52. That would be the total cost for the project, but I didn't make it clear to them that the 25 and the 52 million was just for the Peavine and the Clear Creek. So that is why there needs to be the increase in the total CIP.
So when we are looking at scenario 1 now, can I share my screen, please?
Yes, please.
We
Okay,
had a
can you
question
just
there.
clarify when you're talking about the Clear Creek and you said only the Clear Creek and only the Peavine, and the implication is there's something else. Is that what you mean? Rick, can you explain this a little bit in a way that I can understand it?
There's other storm damage, or other fire damage, storm damage, and those prices were only for the raw water supply
Right,
lines.
okay,
correct?
and
Yeah.
so.
I don't think it's, I don't think it's gonna make some bit of a difference, but I don't think it will make a huge
Okay,
difference.
all right,
because-
so what I'm understanding now is that the 25 and the 52 were the numbers for above ground versus buried, but the problem is that in reality, we have another 5 million in storm damage, and we probably have another 20 million or something in
Fire.
cost overall.
Not quite sure that much, but
It's about, if it's the above ground, it's about around 37 million. Including the 25 for the Peavine and Clear Creek.
And then, so it's another 64 million for the buried?
Yeah,
Okay,
I still cannot share my screen.
does somebody have to help Sudhir?
No,
Share-
at the bottom of his screen, there should be a place where it says share screen. It's a green button.
Yes,
Just
but
go
it
down to
says
the bottom.
it says host disabled participant screen sharing. It says telling me.
Right click on his name.
I did.
I'm gonna change them to hosts. You should be good now.
Okay, it says, in my screen, it says you're the host now, Sudhir.
Okay, good. Yeah, I can see that now. So let me share with you, first of all, the CIP that we are looking at, So here is the CZU pipeline costs. And here's the Peavines line. Okay, that's one project. And then we have the Clear Creek project here. Those two projects are now $25 million. And the overall cost, if you're looking at, for the next 5 years, we got about $80 million in cost, which includes the $25 million for the Peavine. So going back to the dashboard, when we look at, we have the $25 million projects, those two projects. We were looking at 9% revenue adjustments over here before the first, 5 years. Now we are saying we should probably issue 20 million in debt instead of 15 million. And have 12% increases in the first 2 years so that we can meet coverage. And then here is the reserves that we would potentially have over the 10 years. We are slightly under target in 2025. If you wanted to meet target, we would have to go up with maybe 13 or 14% in those first couple of years. So the question is, are we willing to live with a slightly lower reserve in 25 to accommodate, the smaller percentage increases, or we would need to have even larger increases if we wanted to meet that target here in the first 2
I
years.
think that was, you saw that was the second part of this question in terms of the reserves, and I think that, but let me just ask, is this, which scenario are you pointing to now? Is that the above ground or the buried one?
This is the above ground scenario 1, yeah.
So did you do that same calculation for the buried one?
Yes, we can do the same calculation for the buried one. And for the buried one,
so it requires, am I reading this right? Instead of a 12% increase, it's a 15% increase for the first 2 years.
right, 15% for the first 2 years. Let me make sure.
And how about the level of debt?
we are looking at $28 million in debt. So,
as opposed to 20 in the above ground.
yes.
Okay.
Mm.
So, I mean, it's really good that we have these closer numbers, but it actually doesn't, it kind of doesn't change the relative, the
So
relative
this is
effects to
this-
what you could see in the previous data that you know, calculations that you did, is that,
So yeah, you can see here that we're meeting target in each year here with this under this scenario, but we are issuing more debt and have higher rate adjustments, revenue adjustments.
okay, again, is this above ground or below ground?
This is below ground. This is the
Okay.
$52 million project. Yeah. This is where it shows, you know, which scenario we are looking at. This is the 52 million. Can you, by the way, can you see the screen or is it too small for you?
No, well, it's a little, I can see it. I don't know how.
Yeah, we can see
I
it.
can see it.
Yeah, it's okay on the computer. It's maybe a little hard on the
Yeah.
big screen.
So, okay, so in other words, you're saying we could do it with both. But in other words, what if you kind of, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, would it make more sense if we're trying to compare these two scenarios to just say, okay, what if we simply say we're not going up above, you know, 15% for the first 2 years, and we only, just so that the amount of debt and the amount of increase is the same, so we can see the effect on reserves.
Right. The one thing I think that needs to be considered is, you know, we brought this up during the presentation, is whether the bigger project, the below ground project, would actually qualify for FEMA funding. I think that was an issue, you know, so that needs to be
Yes.
considered as well when making a decision as to whether we go with scenario 1 or scenario 2 with the
Yeah,
above
of
ground.
course, that's a good point. Okay, well, I have a hard time seeing if people have their hands up, but Jeff, did you want to pitch in, or maybe I'll go to somebody else?
So I'm looking at this and one thing that clearly has changed in addition to the dollar amounts from the meeting last week is that I believe last week we were talking about uniform increases in revenue going forward each year. And this shows in either case here, it's front end loaded and then goes down quite a bit.
That's true, and it is required because you see we are reaching a critical point here in 2025 in terms of meeting coverage.
Yes.
And that is why we need to have the larger rate revenue adjustments. Plus, if you go with lower revenue adjustments, you would begin to fall below target here. So for example, if you went with, you know, say 12% over here.
I think Jim Mosier had a question too, Gail.
Yeah,
Well, does this suggest that we're going to be doing this 25 or $52 million project in 1 year? It just seems unrealistic that we're going to be able to get, I mean, we're spending all this money up front to do these projects, but is that realistic? I mean, so do we need all this money up front to do a project that we're not going to be actually doing?
no, the reason we need the
Over a period
money,
of 2 or 3 years, right?
the reason we need the money up front, Jim, is that we have to have the revenue for the debt coverage so we can get the debt issued.
But do we need that much debt if we're not actually doing the projects in such a rapid pace?
Well,
So
I guess that's a question for Rick. In other words, if the assumption here is we're going to get everything done by when?
No,
Those projects should be, Sudhir, can you go to the CIP tab? I believe those projects are spread out over at least till 2028.
yeah, so
Oh,
this
yeah.
this chart
Well, there's
shows you
multiple
the
projects here.
Yeah.
relative, yeah, I can show you the numbers themselves, but the amount of cost that we are incurring per year in CIP is represented by the length of these bars. So in 2024, we are looking at almost $30 million, drops down to about 16, back up to 26, 27, and then, you know, drops down to in the 17, 18 range for the next 2 years. So we are front loaded here for the first 5 years.
I guess it's just spending $27 million in 1 year just seems
No, we will not. be.
crazy.
No, the
So-
5 mile will take several years, probably 3
Right.
years or 4 years, and P-Vine could be done in 1 year. It's a much smaller. And then now again, that will depend on the project. Above ground, the environmental review process will be minimal. Buried, most likely,
Right.
it will take several years, and most likely there'd be litigation due to the fact that it's such an impact to the environment.
Yeah, that's a good point. It would probably push those expenses out
Yeah.
quite a bit, but um, I guess I think I'm just going to say what I believe, and that is that I think when I look at this, I just don't. I think it is very difficult for us to afford the buried option. Because we're going to have to ask for a larger rate increase. We're going to have to take out more debt, and it slows the rate at which we reach target reserve values. Now, mind you, I also believe that we don't have to reach the target reserve values in 1 or 2 years. I mean, the district has been under reserving for years, and I think people would understand if we said, look, the next couple of years while we're recovering, we may not be able to build our reserves, and we should be looking at say, reaching there in 5 years. But, I'm just going to say what I think, and I think maybe we should just go around and see what other people's opinions are.
So let me ask a quick question of Rick and Garrett here. We have the 2 big projects, the 5 mile and P-Vine, and then we have a whole raft of additional projects that are on the schedule. It would seem to me that we might want to get the 2 big ones done and get the FEMA money moving and stuff. The others could selectively be pushed out a bit if we had to. But if we don't get these 2 big ones done, then we potentially run into problems with FEMA, and we don't know, environmental things may change in that time period. It's hard to say. But the longer we stall on that, the harder it gets to do them, I think. And some of these others are, dig up this street and replace the pipe, or put in new pipe at some other location. Some of those could be pushed out a bit if we were running into debt coverage issues.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend that we move on the raw water pipelines
Yes.
as quick as possible. For a quick bullet point type. One is that our system, we're moving water from our well fields up in the summertime, and we were fortunate. We just had a very wet year. Surface water was abundant, but we're also utilizing Fall Creek not in compliance with the water rights in Felton. So I think that, and the longer we wait to put those streams back in, the more issues we may have by trying to permit and get those streams back in. We're guaranteed, if we put them back in to pre-disaster conditions, we are pretty much guaranteed 90% of FEMA. If we go underground, besides all the other issues, we'll have to apply for a change in project and go through a lot of appeal processes to get that extra funds. They'll give us the money, they'll pledge the money, no problem, obligate the money, no problem, to put it back like it was. But the additional funds, retaining walls, bury, cut roads in, and so forth, we will have to apply for those funds. So getting that water source back in has several strong points to do that one. Do those 2 projects immediately. Start with P-Vine first, and then move right over to the 5 mile. You can be doing environmental and a lot of different types of engineering on the 5 mile while you're doing P-Vine. But putting that back is a relatively easy project because the pad, the trail has already been established. Yes, you have cleanup, yes, you have to go install. The number one drawback of doing it that way is it is not protected from fire. We are back to pre-existing, and I don't know if anybody in this room can tell you when we may have another fire again. I mean, hopefully never, but that is the number one drawback. But also I would really recommend that this committee go to the website under the engineering section, read the peer review by 3 of the top geotechnical engineers in Santa Cruz County that have worked on the Ben Lomond Mountain, that basically question if that's even constructible to bury.
Okay,
So I'm
so,
gonna recommend that.
Oh,
so we're sitting here wrestling with the fact that under the current projection in fiscal 25, the debt coverage almost goes below the line. And we can't do that without some serious consequences with the debt that we have. So it seems to me that, you know, and we have a highest priority, I believe, on the raw water supply. So it seems to me that if we wanted to rework this, we would move some of the other smaller projects out of ways, which would bring that curve back up a bit in 2025. And I think that's probably the most reasonable solution.
That could be done.
Jim Mosher?
well, I agree with both Gail and what both board members have said. And I just don't see how we can do so much capital projects at once, as I was saying before. But I don't think there's much debate that we should be doing the above ground. Especially based on what Rick said, I already come to that conclusion. I worry about the environmental impact of doing it underground, and I think it could raise a lot of concerns in the community. Whereas doing it above ground, the way it was before, I think would be something that the folks who are concerned about the watershed would not have any problem with. So I think that's another reason to say that that's how we should be doing it. And that's how I'd recommend the board move forward.
Monica?
Thanks, Gail. This is a lot of information that some of it I'm hearing for the first time. So I'm still getting my bearings. You know,
Well, if you want to pass, you can.
I guess I have a couple of questions. I think I know this might sound super naive, but like, is FEMA like your insurance plan for if they burn again? Like, is there any other way of protecting them financially in the case of a future fire?
You know, using HDPE pipe, putting above ground, again, it would be pretty much susceptible to fire. I mean, fire, you're not gonna protect that pipe. And one of the problems is that you could bury portions of the pipe, but even burying portions of the pipe in an area that the pipe burns that wasn't protected, those VOC chemicals contaminate the whole pipeline.
Okay.
And so it doesn't do you any good to bury half of it, you know, not unless you can say the fire is not gonna get in that area. But it pretty much is, if you can't bury it and keep it buried, because what will happen is it will slough off, and then a couple of years down the road, there'll be big portions of it exposed, and that will be susceptible to fire. The key is, once we do pick a method, is to price out, which we haven't done yet, the above ground repair. Because I think you'll find you'll be able to replace it twice for the cost of replacing it once under the buried scenario. So I think for your return on your investment, above ground will be the way to put that back.
All right, that's helpful. And I agree with Jim. I mean, I'm hearing like from all points, whether it's the financial, environmental, feasibility, legal risk,
And
it's
one of
above
the-
ground is the way to
One
go.
of the problems is, though, with FEMA, yes, down the road, 3 to 4 years down the road, we should get reimbursement. It's the reserves up front that we ran down in CZU, and you know, Jeff will tell you that he was very concerned about cash flow during that time frame, and so was Kendra. So getting the reserves back up is important, but also finding that right time frame. I don't think we want to do it very fast. I think we want to do it in slower increments to put a less burden on our ratepayers.
Thank you.
But that's the issue with FEMA, is it takes 3 to 5 years to get your money.
And we have built that into the model as well. You can see that even though we are incurring costs over here, FEMA money is coming in these later years here. Yeah.
Jim Bond.
If the question on the table is whether we go underground or above ground, then I don't have anything to add. I think you guys have all done the right analysis, and I think maybe the question Monica might have been asking, or the question I would ask, isn't so much if we do above ground, is it physically protected? I think the answer is obviously no. If God forbid we have another fire, will FEMA then cover us again for an above ground replacement?
I believe so.
Only if it's declared natural disaster.
Yeah, as
Right.
long as it's declared.
Right,
natural
yeah, assuming,
disaster, Yes, and the magnitude of that fire was.
Well.
I would think so, and I don't worry about that. And for a lot of the FEMA reimbursement, the grant funding is 75%. This one, the president took the extra step and bumped it up to 90%,
Right.
which is huge to replace this at 90%.
I think another part of Monica's question though was, is it insurable besides relying on FEMA? And that wasn't really the answer.
As in,
Like with the pipeline being
As in with
insured.
Lloyd's London Insurance or something like that.
right, and our current insurance does not cover any of our distribution system. And then when you go into a catastrophic event, such as a federally declared disaster, it changes your insurance deductibles. It moves it right away to $500,000, which still is not much, but it takes a lot of the safeguards that FEMA would give you away. So again, none of our underground piping is insured.
So do we have an estimate for the above ground? We're estimating it at
Yes.
25 million and
We do have an estimate. Was that 60 million or 64
No.
million?
Above,
for above.
No, for below ground.
oh, below is 52.
Yeah, but
Based
I
on
didn't
the
know we had an
fire-
estimate for above ground.
We do not at this point, and that's something we need. And
So the 25 million is just a placeholder?
Well, the FNL study gave us an engineering estimate, but they aren't a contractor.
no, and
And it wasn't,
it was only, what, like 6 million or so less.
Yeah,
and that did not pass the
Didn't
straight
make
face
sense.
test.
Yeah.
Because you're cutting roads, you're putting retaining walls in.
Yeah.
Which is the bulk of that project. So we need to do a new engineer estimate of putting it back above ground, utilizing the same methods that we utilized in the past.
But for our financial picture, we're using 25 million as a placeholder for that?
That's correct.
Okay, I am very conscious of the time because I know some people have to leave at 5. So I guess what I would like to say is that we've sort of reached a consensus here that both from financial considerations and feasibility of construction, environmental concerns, and just lengthy legal challenges that might come from this, we think that the above ground option seems like the way to go. I guess I would like to just finish up because we've to also get a sense of consensus on this idea of how fast do we need to build our reserves back up, because Rick has already raised it. And I think that is also a piece of information that Raftellus really needs to model. You know, they've modeled it trying to bring the reserves up to our target values fairly quickly. And Rick, you were sort of suggesting that I don't know if you had a time frame in mind, but it was not 2 years anyway. It was something longer. Is that?
That's correct. I was thinking more somewhere around a 4-year,
Yeah.
4 to 5 year. Because we will at a certain point in time start receiving some reimbursement from FEMA. What we spent in CZU fire in Kenner, what, 3 million right off the bat, and what, roughly $1.5 million on the flood. So we're like 4.5 million in the last 2 disasters to keep the system up and running. So, I think that we would be okay if we slowed that process down a bit, but made sure we did reach our target. But I think that's important.
Kendra, did you want to express a view on this?
As far as building reserves up fast or longer than the 2 years, I just think that depending on how low the fund balances are, because we've obviously had the fires in 2020, which, you know, depleted our reserves. And then 3 years later, we had, you know, the storm disasters. So I don't know if it would be best to go too far out, just in case, you know, we were to have another disaster, but obviously that's something you can't really predict. And, you know, maybe err on the side of caution to have the reserves at a, you know, a plentiful level, just in case we do incur some kind of emergency in the future. So maybe, I mean, maybe not the 2 years, but and maybe not the 5 years, but we could, you know, meet in the middle to kind of balance out, you know, the amount of revenue adjustments we need. Those are kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, just to clarify, I wasn't thinking that we shouldn't try to build the reserves. I think we should have an incremental increase every year, right? So that after, you know, 2 years, it might be one way, and then 3, it'd be more. So that by the time we're out at 4 or 5, we're up to what our target values are. So that the idea would be that if there was another catastrophe, you know, 2 or 3 years out, there is some headroom for it. So that was what I meant, not to not build them at all. And I think Jeff has been very, and you too, Kendra, have been very thoughtful about, you know, making sure we also have enough room for cash flow issues to be taken care of.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Add one thing is we have a problem here in 2025 in terms of meeting coverage. So, you know, if you want to build up the reserves over multiple years, I mean, we can reduce the amount of debt that we are incurring that allows us to go lower percentages. And that means that we won't meet our target over here until we hit 2027, actually. And then we might need to have higher adjustments, you know, to make sure that we have adequate funds in the later years. So we are probably looking at 8%, you know, down, you know, every year after that. Yeah. So this is probably, if you're looking at this 10%, you know, I think we are almost at target here. So this is something that we could potentially do, have 10% revenue adjustment to the $17 million debt. You're significantly below target here. You make it up close to the target in next year. And then, so that this is an option that gives you a little break in terms of having a little bit lower revenue adjustments in the first couple of years. And if you're thinking that you don't need to incur this much in CIP and that you won't be doing this much in CIP, obviously, if you were to reschedule this, you know, push some of these projects out, then that would also help, because you know, you've put more projects here in this time frame, then you would not have this issue of the reserves falling below target as well. So this the balancing act between different things, and percentage increases, debt, and the total amount of capital that we need to spend.
So maybe following up on Jim Mosher's comment, maybe it would be worth doing a scenario model where the capital expenditures are not so large in the first year, just because we
Reduce the front end load.
Yeah.
um,
You're not gonna get that far on the 5 mile until this.
yeah, so you know, spreading these out a little bit, and then seeing the effect that would have, you know, if we went with the front loading of 10%, and then how that would affect the out year increases in revenue we'd need.
Studio, Rick and I can work with you on that.
Yeah, we don't have to do it now, but I think that Jim Mosher had a good point on this, and I think it's kind of one of those things that when this gets shown, it will, you know, other people might recognize that. So I think it's worth doing. Holly told me that we do have one member of the public here, and I want to make sure that I don't think I see a hand raised, but if Bruce Holloway is there, I want to make sure he has a chance to weigh in on what we've discussed so far.
Thanks, Director Mayhew. When I saw the presentation the other night, with 9% increases as far as the eye could see, it made me wonder if you were only setting rates for 1 year, what would you do then? And I think I've seen some of the answer to that with the 12 and the 15% increases. I'm mindful of the fact that we really skipped a year of increase already.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe it should be 20 and 12 or something like that. Number 2 here says there's another committee that's going to be talking about how to build the pipeline. It seems like there's universal agreement in this room that everybody wants to do the above ground pipeline, but I know Director Ackman in particular has said in the past that she wanted the community to be involved in the decision and wanted there to be community buy-in. Some people do feel that the way the pipeline was constructed before is vulnerable to fire. So I guess
well, that's why we're having these 2 workshops.
well, I hope you can come to I hope the board can come to a decision. I mean, I don't even, are you going to be able to come to a decision about the pipeline before this financial plan has to be approved? The other thing I wanted to say is about a bond. I guess I'm not sure that the debt coverage issues would be the same if the district did a bond. I know you got to get people to vote by a 2/3 majority, but in the past, people have supported the school district, people have supported fire districts. I think as time goes on, people are going to forget about what happened, but right now, you probably would have a great deal of support if your financial plan included a bond issue. I'm very nervous about continuing with what's been going on here, which is borrow a lot of money and then have it sit around for years before it gets spent. So I'm not enthusiastic about going out and borrowing $20 million unless you can spend it. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. And actually, why don't we take advantage of you bringing up that question because it's one of the questions on our list, which is, it wasn't entirely clear to me, Sudhir, whether we're talking about loans, a commercial loan, a federal low interest loan for infrastructure, or a bond. And can you describe to us what you think it should be and how you settled on that?
Well, what we have done here, being conservative, we have just assumed that this is a market debt, essentially. So you're borrowing money for, I think it is for 20 years at 4.5% is what we've assumed here, which is market debt right now. So it's not low interest loans, it's not FIFA loans or any other federal loans and so forth. It's basically just going to the market. If you did manage to get any of those other better terms on these loans, then obviously it would help a little bit in terms of what your expenses, your debt service would be, and also your debt coverage requirements. So but we haven't heard anything in that regard the district has applied for or has any leads on any of those low interest loans.
Can you tell us what your experience is working with other districts, how they approach this?
Yeah, so I think I'm not sure that you qualify for state revolving fund loans, especially since this project is being 90% financed by FEMA anyway. But it's possible that you could get VFIA loans which have a little better term than just going to the market. And that's possible, that you could potentially do that, yeah.
And answering Bruce's question, a bond is mostly just because the difficulty of getting the 2/3 vote and the sort of complexity of that is.
Yeah, I don't know whether it all depends upon your charter. I don't know whether you need to go to a 2/3 vote to issue these bonds. You could use certificates of participation, which definitely does not require any voting requirements. You pay a slightly higher interest when you do CO COPS certificates of participation as compared to a revenue bond. But I don't know that, does your charter require you to go to vote to do revenue bonds as well?
I can't answer that question. Rick, can you?
I didn't hear what you said.
Does the board require a 2/3 vote for a revenue bond?
No, I couldn't answer that.
The charter.
Yeah, I can't answer
Okay,
that.
well, that's something, Kendra, maybe you can, you know,
Yeah.
because we should be able to answer that question on the 14th and explain why we're going there.
Okay.
Okay, well, we've only got 10 minutes more. So I think we we actually dealt with number 3 there. I think I would just clarify, there was a question, maybe this came from Bruce Holloway, is how are we going to show the fire surcharge? At least as how I understand these models, is that we would do nothing to change the fire surcharge, that it would basically end in 2026 after the collection of 5 million. Is that correct?
That's staff's recommendation, yes.
Okay.
I think that was so that was my question. That was more so like I wanted clarification on, so right now, let's just say the 5/8 meter fire surcharge is the $9.67. Sudhir, would that still be showing on the bill as that amount, or is that somehow incorporated into the new rate schedule? I guess we haven't really decided what the rate schedules are going to be, so I wasn't sure how that
Well,
would.
that's kind of more a rate schedule question, but
Yeah.
But certainly I think we would continue to show it as a separate item just because people are used to that and we want them to understand. But I just want to clarify that you've in your model here, basically you've got it ending in 2026, Sudhir. Is
Right.
that correct?
So once that ends, then it basically gets absorbed into your rates.
Yeah,
You know, the
after that.
revenue that you require from that gets absorbed into your rates.
Okay, good. That's what I thought. Let's go back to number 1, which is basically sort of some of the assumptions that underlie these, and having to do with inflation, and then incremental costs that are not going to be captured in cost of living increase. And I'm just going to say that, just put my bias out here right out front, is that I'm concerned that may have underestimated inflation for the first few years. And Jeff, I think, pointed out when we discussed this correctly, or he pointed out and he was correct, that we're still kind of, for the purposes of construction and other things that affect us as a utility, we're still kind of working our way through the inflation and the supply chain issues that are related to COVID. And so that taking a 10-year average may underestimate our costs, not for necessarily 5 years, but may underestimate them for 2 to 3 years. And so, Sudhir, could you kind of address that concern of mine?
Yes, and that's looking into a crystal ball, really. The past year and a half or 2 years, we've had pretty significant increases, so I would suspect that we have gone past that hump and we should be back to more normal times now. We should not be seeing the same kinds of issues that we had, unless COVID picks up again worldwide and it creates all kinds of issues. That's an unknown. But otherwise, I personally think that we should be getting back to a more normal scenario. And in fact, potentially even seeing a little lower inflation, because they've gone up so fast in the last 2 years. Things are getting back to normal. So, from the capital cost perspective, I know that those costs really shot up last year in 22. And so I'm kind of thinking that we should be back to a more normal scenario, and that's kind of we don't have the 23 over here, but that should be reflected in this, that the rates are coming down again. Yeah, the inflation rates are coming down again. So using a 4% for capital cost, I think ongoing basis over 10 years, I think it's quite reasonable, even though the first year might be a little bit heavier, which I don't think that is, 4% inflation is not being too low. I don't think it is too low. I think it's appropriate.
Sudhir, this is
Yes.
Jeff. I think my point was that we're looking at primarily a consumer price index there, and very little of what our district purchases. Very few of those items are in the consumer price index.
Mm-hmm.
We're not buying milk and flour and bread and those sorts of things. And my question really was how the consumer price index might relate to buying things like pipe and concrete and tractors and trucks and things like that, which
Yeah.
I think are probably, I suspect that they're a little higher inflation rate on those, but I don't know.
Right. So those items which are considered capital items, and therefore they are inflated at the capital 4% range. We got capital going at 4%. What we've got at 3% are basically salaries and some other items which are not included in benefits, utilities, and capital. So.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that you had thought that through, because like I said, we're not buying, like I said, milk and butter and eggs and
Right.
things like that.
I think they have accounted for that in the capital part. I want to make sure that we get to Monica, because I think she may have a hard stop at 5.
Yeah, thanks. I'm okay today. I can go a little bit over if needed. My point relates a little bit, but it's also going back to the rate increase in 24 and having it be so high, because we're talking about like the cost of living, right? And then we're saying we're going to hit our ratepayers at 10% or higher amount these first couple of years. But what we're seeing, at least in the here and now, is that people's incomes aren't keeping up. As a CEO of a large organization, like I'm starting to hear what my health insurance costs are going to be next year. And then if like something like my water bills or my other sort of utility bills go up at the same increase, right now they're super high compared to previous years, and I'm trying to budget for that. And I know that households are doing the same thing, and our biggest ratepayers, right, the school, the county parks, they're also trying to grapple with this like super high increase in all the different line items. And so as we're thinking about the 10%, like however we can smooth it, because in the here and now, the economy hasn't recovered from these inflations, and we're seeing it projected into the next fiscal year, at least running a public sector type operation. So that's something that I would ask to be considered.
Yeah, I think that's also, just sort of a general thing that we want, to the extent we can. I mean, we have the responsibility to make sure we get enough revenue to keep the lights on and, run the district. But we also don't want to burden current ratepayers for the catastrophes of the last few years, when the benefits of dealing with them actually accrue for 20 or 30 years, right? So I think there's a good rationale, for fairness of why you want to spread this out. And of course, taking debt does that to a certain extent. But I hear you on what you're saying. Sudhir, did you want to respond to that?
One of the things that we talked about is potentially looking at the CIP, and obviously if we do something, in terms of spreading the CIP cost down, I think that will help us to mitigate some of the revenue adjustments. But I think we could potentially have a lower debt issue, then you would not have this issue with the coverage requirement here. You might have to do another issue later on, potentially, but that would help to mitigate these revenue adjustments that we need. Because you can see your coverage is going up over here pretty rapidly. So you do have additional, for example, if I wanted to issue some additional debt here, if I spread my costs out and I issue another $10 million in debt here, I'll reduce this down to, my screen has gone blank. I can potentially drop these rate adjustments down to 8%, and so forth. So it all depends upon, what we are doing with the CIP here. And then if we are going to be delaying some of the projects, we are assuming that these are for the, your CZA projects. If those get delayed, then the FEMA grants will also be potentially delayed. So we need to look at all of those, have a understanding, compound understanding of all of these things before we can come up with a decision on what to do here.
Yeah. Is this something that you could maybe work with Kendra and Rick with in terms of sort of a realistic scenario for maybe how long it's actually going to take us to do some of these things, given their permitting and
absolutely. The question is whether, we are going to be ready on the 14th with this, because today is the 12th already. So we only have one day here,
understand.
or 1.5 days, basically,
And as long as I can remember, we have never completed our capital improvement project list in the fiscal years that we budgeted. And I do believe that.
So
100% completion rate.
Yeah.
So, there's always one reason or another, whether we couldn't get pipe for a year or there's environmental issues. It's never that I can remember it's been a funding issue as much as it has been.
Think of the fish ladder.
Yeah, well, fish ladder, how many years it's been pushed out.
So is Peavine being projected to be done 3 years out and then Clear Creek 5 years out? Or is it projected to be done way earlier on this and that's why it's taller?
Peavine drill would be much earlier and 5 miles.
Well, it's gonna be at least 3 years.
Yeah.
Peavine, we have out till 2026 and Clear Creek's out till 2028.
So
you've already sort of spread them out, but maybe also deferring, in addition to spreading those out a little bit more, deferring some of the other projects as Jeff was suggesting, because that's also part of the reason for that big chunk in the first year. But let's see what what you can do in that regard. I personally, I think I like the idea of that, if we can stay at 10%. I'm not adverse to I'm not adverse to a little bit of front loading, because as Bruce Holloway suggested, we've already sort of foregone a year of increases or more, but I don't know, maybe try to stay at 10 or, and then see if that's possible to drop that down in out years to something a little smaller. Does that sound okay to other people? You want to go ahead and just say what you think?
It sounds like a plan to me.
Okay. I think, our goal tonight is to give, this evening is, that we don't have to decide on the absolute model, but we're just trying to give them guidance. And certainly there'll be more time after this meeting on the 14th, and some decisions will have to be finalized at the board meeting on the 21st. So there's still some time to work on this after Thursday night, but it'd be nice to be closer to what everybody in this room feels a little bit more comfortable with.
I would just say, let's really be realistic about what we're going to get done, so that we're, just from experience, as you said, Rick, I just don't think we're going to, it's going to go slower than we'd like. You know that.
And I look at Felton Heights tank, I look at all the different projects and you try to plan and there's always something comes up. Fish ladder is a great example. And that, but it worked out, we got a $1 million grant too. So there is sometimes it works good when
it takes time.
There's tank coatings not been on for 4 years, 5
Those
years.
are the deferred maintenance that should move to the top of the list. But,
Okay, well, let's, going back to the issue of, sort of some of the assumptions. I think that the question here is, I guess my own fear is, or let me put it this way, I would like to see a sensitivity analysis. In other words, if your estimates for inflation are not quite right in the first year, and it's worse the way Jeff and I are wondering that it might be, what's the effect? Can you just plug in that and show it? I think if we could, that would just make me feel better. Here's my fundamental fear is if we don't get inflation right, plus there's nothing in there for all, sort of incremental increases in expenses that on things that we don't have much control on, we're kind of going to be in the same box that previous boards got into, where because we underestimated operating expenses increases due to inflation and incremental costs, we end up having to pull back on capital expenditures, etc. So anyway, that's my concern. I'm glad to hear that, we can at least plug a number in to say that, it might be $250,000 for the legal fees associated with the CUP. But some of these others, I don't know how you estimate them, but I'll stop there. Somebody else talk.
no, and just keep in mind that every project we do, we evaluate finances before we release a construction bid. So if for some reason we have to wait or put off 6 months, a year, I mean, we can do that very easily. And not, most likely we wouldn't jeopardize supplying water. That's just, we would have to manage our finances if we do get into some type of bind, which I don't think we will, just because of the construction schedule.
Well, I'm not really talking about construction now. I've moved back to item 1, where I'm talking about sort of unfunded mandates that keep coming down about reporting and monitoring, or increasing water standards. Like if we have to put in something that takes PFAS, out of our water, that's going to be expensive. And how are things like that being taken account of in this model? And my impression is they're not. And I think that they're out there. And
so actually, if I can, I think the first priority would be to look at, scheduling, prioritizing these projects, identifying what projects you really need to be done. We have adequate reserves here. We got 4.5 months of O&M, which translates to about $3.5 million. Yeah. So if you were to incur additional costs you do have time to, you would have to draw down those reserves to account for any things that come down the pipeline which were not expected. The issue is, again, and you can have another emergency reserve as well if you want. You see, the only thing is that all of those elements are going to cause your revenue adjustments to increase. And the bottom line is, what kind of revenue adjustments are you willing to live with to accommodate for these kinds of things, So
I guess my response would be is that some of these are not going to be like one-time emergency expenses. They are incremental increases in costs. So it's not really responsible to just keep dipping into reserves to pay them.
What it allows you to do, ma'am, is just that first year you can dip into those reserves, and then you have to go back and take another look at the program and see how that is going to impact, potentially to have another 280 notice after that. So if you do run into a situation where, and that is handled through another reserve called rate stabilization reserves, but all of those reserves basically, you can build those reserves up to account for those kinds of potential issues, but that means that you're going to have larger revenue adjustments in upfront, you see?
Well, I think that the responsibility of a board is to make sure that we're financially sound. And I realize there's also has to be balanced on the other side by what burden we want to place on our ratepayers. But I guess I just don't want to create a situation where somebody can argue that, well, your increases in operating expenses are more than what you predicted they were going to be, so therefore you're doing something wrong. When I think that there are clear things that are going to incrementally increase our costs, and that, and I hope your assessment of cost of living is correct. But okay, but I will stop there. And Jeff, you want to? Do you have any other things you'd like to talk about?
No, not really, but Mr. Holloway has his hand up again.
Oh, he does. I'm sorry. Let me just go around the board once, everybody on the committee, and then I'll go out to Bruce. Okay. Jim Mosher, did you have anything you wanted to add to this discussion?
I guess I'm just curious why the FEMA reimbursements are taking so long. We've only gotten 476,000 so far. And we spent, is that still true, 4.7 million? Is this typical across everybody's experience with FEMA, 3 to 5 years? And
if I'm talking to the county and others, it's been the worst.
It's just crazy. It seems to me that's one of the big problems here is that, we're having this revenue that we're promised from the federal government is pushed back so far that it really affects our near-term rates. So,
Jim, one of the things they do is they prioritize like homeowners associations and things like that ahead of public agencies. So a homeowners association that had their road wiped out might get their money in half the time that we would.
right. And I guess just one other comment that I think is going to come up is that we don't really have an estimate for above ground. And when I made a presentation about the district last week, Director Fultz was in the audience, and he wants to stick with the 47 million estimate for above ground. And how soon can we get an estimate for the above ground that you would feel comfortable with?
I would think, it's going to the engineering committee Thursday to discuss above below ground.
Yeah.
I'm asking, there's a memo on that agenda to recommend we go with above ground. Now to the full board, and then I will take that into the next board meeting. I will request the full board to approve the above ground installation. I'm not sure how the engineering committee is going to go. I know there's strong desire to put it below grade, but take a look at the peer review from your engineering geologist, and it's not constructible. And that it was a great peer review, I think. They say more information is needed, but I think you'll never get all the information.
But when can we get an above
I'm
ground
hoping,
estimate?
that's like a 30-day process to sit down and get those prices.
I'm just thinking that it has such a big impact on what we're doing here now.
But when you look, Jim, at the project above versus below, the magnitude of the below grade with cutting actual,
No, I get all that. I'm just concerned that we're using a number that is kind of pulled out of the hat, and it has such an impact
It's
on
going to be concerned about as well.
Okay.
Monica?
I have no further comments. Thank you.
Jim Bond?
So, yeah, I'm just going to echo what I think Jim's trying to say is that he's not worried about whether or not we're going to go above or below, but and getting back to what Gail had brought up, let's have as realistic numbers as we can for projections, because we don't want to go back in a year and find out that we've underestimated and And yes, we've normalized inflation at 4% when we know it's going to be 6% this year. So I'm a ratepayer. I don't want to pay any more than I have to, but let's do our duty, as Gail had pointed out, and let's be as realistic as we can. That's
Rick, is there a way that essentially what you're proposing is building a trail? Can you just get a number of what it typically costs to build a trail per mile? Just use
The
that.
trail is there, and it's to clean up the trail. And basically what we would do is we'd get pricing CCC crews who originally constructed the trail.
No, but what I'm trying to get at Jim Mosher's point of we just need some kind of number that seems a little less pulled out of a hat than 20 million. And if you could just get what the industry standard is for building a trail and steep.
Well, that's the problem. It's a unique type of construction. And I can work with the National Forest, State Parks, and the same engineers that did the peer review. They have some understanding, but what we need to do is get the helicopter lift cost, get the pipe cost. There's a half a dozen pricings that we can get relatively quick to put together a pretty good estimate.
Yeah, labor is going to be your biggest issue.
Right.
And I don't think we can necessarily count on being able to get CCC crews.
Well, I've been in contact with them, and if we get, you call and get on their schedule 6 months to a year before, they love these type of projects. That's what they do.
Okay, well, if that's realistic, it's just I have visions of
is.
us standing there with, a huge pile of pipe and all the accoutrement and no CCC crew.
Well, and we would, but I don't need to go into how we would construct it.
I'm being a little
We can get
facetious, but yes.
Okay, all right. I would like to go out. Bruce has been standing there patiently, so go ahead.
Still looking at the dip in the debt coverage curve over there. And since you have the consultant on the line, he's probably a homeowner. He probably has a property tax bill. He's probably paying for school bonds on that tax bill. So that's my model for how a water district bond would work. It would be on your property tax bill. So I guess my primitive understanding is if the district borrowed $24 million on its own, the way it has in the past, then immediately there's going to be principal and interest due, and that's what needs to be covered. That's what this debt coverage ratio is all about. You need more revenue to cover more principal and interest payments. But if the bond is on individual property owners' tax bill, I think 24 million divided by 8,000 connections would be about 3,000 per household. And I'm roughly estimating that would cost about $200 a year. And it seems to me that would be off of the districts. I mean, the district, it wouldn't be debt, it wouldn't be principal and interest payments that the district would have to cover. So I'm thinking that it's fundamentally different, a bond versus these certificates of participation or whatever. Seems like it's fundamentally different in that a bond is better for the district in terms of this debt coverage ratio. Isn't it? Isn't that true?
There, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is a general obligation bond, and that does require a 2/3 vote of the public. Yeah, that is not something that the district can issue without approval, 2/3 approval.
There's an election in March.
That would go on the property tax roll because that's a general obligation bond, and that goes on each property. That would not flow through the water rates essentially. So you would basically drop the debt service costs that are part of the general obligation bond from the water enterprise. They would be on the tax roll. And I don't think you need coverage for that either, because that's it's all secured by properties, so there is no coverage requirement there either. It doesn't show up on the water enterprise, as a matter of fact, so we don't have to worry about coverage for that. Yeah.
So this is Jim. I just want to make an observation. Given that we've had two bad events in the recent history, if there's no better time to ask for a bond than right now, I think.
Yes.
I I mean, if we can't get a bond now, we would, I mean, what would it take?
Yeah,
Are you referring to general obligation bonds?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, you're right. And that would actually, if you were to eliminate the debt service, just show that you are actually getting these as general obligation bonds. Let me see if I can just play around with that real quickly here. Proposed debt, annual debt service. It would make a big difference to your, you see, you can,
Wow.
you're
Yeah.
going to pass it on in another manner to your customers, obviously, but you could go back with, maybe 7% revenue adjustments,
Mhm.
Again, I've changed a bunch of numbers here, so let me go back to go 100% over here and 100% over here, which is what we had under the current. But again, you are falling a little
Right.
under over here, but you have adequate, coverage on your existing debt, and you can definitely go with lower revenue adjustments because you're taking it off your. See, you don't even need. You are going to build up your reserves gradually. You don't need to have, you could get by with 7% probably, or even less. Yeah. You're going to be under target here, but then you make it up in the next year. There's 1 year that you're under target, but then you make it up. Yeah.
And maybe if the capital projects don't go as fast as we've optimistic.
Right. Yeah. If the capital projects don't go as fast, then you are going to have adequate reserves over there. Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can't, however, fool ourselves. I mean, the ratepayers will still be, they'll be paying for it. It's just that it won't appear on our bill.
Right. It doesn't appear on your bill. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
You're right. It would be tax deductible.
It would be property owners.
Yes.
Right.
That's show up on their mortgages, if anything.
okay. Well, that's very interesting. I think maybe that's something, Rick, Kendra, that you can also explore as an alternative. I think, I mean, I don't really know like how fast you can get an object. I mean, this has to go through an election. So
right.
When would this happen?
March is the next election.
Yeah.
Filing deadline is December. And there's another election in November next year.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think we've kind of covered the biggies here. Are there any other questions or comments?
I have one comment, and that is we needed to have this discussion about a month ago.
Yes, I agree, and followed up with things, and I regret that we didn't. But okay. Any besides that lamentation, is there any other comment?
Grumble, 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 grumble.
No, I see none.
Okay, all right. Well, I really appreciate that you've taken the time, Sudhir, and you did I mean, I felt like you did a good job answering my questions, and I feel more confident. And I think hopefully, I mean, I realize, you can't like magically do all the things that we've talked about by the presentation on the 14th, but at least I feel like now you're not going to be blindsided by questions from us or any members of the public, because we've kind of surfaced the things that I think are likely to concern people. And then after the 14th, we can discuss more and see what the results of the board meeting of the 21st are. So anyway, thank you very much.
Sure.
If there are no objections, I will adjourn this meeting. Hearing no objections, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sudhir.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Where is my?
I do too.
Yeah.